Every empire says its money is safe. Every government states that its promises will last forever. But history shows again and again that this trust often turns out to be empty. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy during the American Civil War to modern-day Lebanon, people have woken up in the morning to find that their savings had almost no value left. Salaries became meaningless, and plans for the future collapsed. In fact, collapse is not something rare. On the contrary, it has happened frequently throughout history. That's why the real question shouldn't be, will the system collapse? But rather, how do we protect ourselves if it does? Most of the time we look at our money and our banks and assume they are very solid, but the truth is that money is not something as solid as rock. Money is actually a matter of trust. It has value as long as people trust it. When that trust is shaken, its value can disappear overnight. When we look at history, we see that every economic collapse leaves a lesson. It shows us which things truly preserve value and which ones can vanish in an instant. The interesting part is this. The people who come out of big crises in the best condition are usually not the ones who believe in the system the most, but the ones who question it first. For example, think about the Byzantine Empire. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it managed to survive for nearly another 1,000 years. At the center of its economy was a gold coin called the Solidus. This coin was so trusted that merchants from Europe to the Middle East accepted it without hesitation. It was almost like the global currency of the medieval world. But over time, the Byzantine rulers also fell into a familiar mistake. They slowly began reducing the purity of the gold coin. They mixed cheaper metals into it. At first no one noticed, but eventually trust weakened. The coin that had once been the backbone of trade started to lose its value. During this time, the people who managed to preserve their wealth were usually the same ones, those who held real gold or owned land outside direct state control. The lesson here is simple. Governments often cannot resist the temptation to reduce the value of their money, and when they do, people move toward assets that can truly hold value. But not every economic shock comes from monetary policy. Sometimes unexpected events turn everything upside down. The Black Death in the 14th century is a good example of this. Between 1347 and 1351, nearly half of Europe's population died. Cities were abandoned, villages were deserted, and trade routes collapsed. But the economic side of the story was a little different from what we might expect. Because so many people died, the number of workers dropped dramatically. This increased the importance of the surviving labor force. Wages rose. Land and food became more abundant compared to people. For those who had some money or goods, this actually became a huge opportunity. Abandoned houses and empty farmland could be bought very cheaply. In other words, the crisis created new opportunities for some people. We saw a similar situation during the COVID pandemic. Supply chains were disrupted and governments printed trillions of dollars to keep economies running. But this process also created major inequality. People who had cash or investment capital bought houses, stocks, and companies. Many people who lived on salaries struggled. Crises often work in the same way. They reward those with reserves and put those without them in difficult positions. Banking crises also offer similar lessons. In the 14th century, Florence was the financial center of Europe. Powerful banking families dominated the city. These banks had lent large sums of money to King Edward III of England. But when the king failed to repay his debts, the banks collapsed like dominoes. Many people lost their savings. Trade stopped. Florence experienced a severe economic shock. People realized something important. The idea of too big to fail doesn't really exist. This lesson appeared again later. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 or the freezing of bank accounts in Lebanon reminded the world of the same truth. A similar story happened during the American Civil War. Both the North and the South printed large amounts of money to finance the war. The North issued a currency called the greenback, which gradually lost value. In the South, the situation was even worse. The grayback currency lost value so quickly that inflation reached unbelievable levels. In the end, many people's lifetime savings almost completely disappeared. But those who owned land, food, or gold were able to protect themselves. Something similar happened during the French Revolution. The revolutionary government issued a paper currency called the assignat. At first it seemed to work, but as the government kept printing more money, the currency quickly lost value. Farmers refused to accept paper money and began demanding silver or goods instead. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 offered another lesson. Thailand and several Asian countries had borrowed heavily in US dollars. when their currencies collapsed. Those debts suddenly became much heavier, economies were shaken, and unemployment rose. This crisis showed something important. Borrowing in someone else's currency can be extremely risky. A more recent example is Lebanon. In 2019, banks suddenly limited withdrawals. People could no longer access their own accounts. The Lebanese pound lost most of its value. Many people saw the savings they had built for years nearly disappear overnight. In these kinds of crises, the people who tend to do better are usually those who keep their money in different places, own real assets like gold or property, have savings outside the banking system. History keeps telling us the same thing. Monetary systems can change, governments can change, and banks can fail. But some things lose value much more slowly. There's also another important point. Wealth is not only about what you own, it is also about what you can do. Even during crises, people still need bread, food, repairs, and trade. That's why people who can produce something valuable usually manage to stay standing in the long run. In the end, history shows us that every crisis is not only a collapse, but also a transformation. While some people suffer huge losses, others find opportunities. So the real question is this: if the system shakes one day, will you be holding only paper promises or something that can truly preserve value? History may not repeat itself exactly, but the lessons it offers often remain the same. Ignoring those lessons usually comes at a very high cost.